Hello and welcome to Q&A. Tonight, the beleaguered Optus chief quits after a series of scandals. What's next for the troubled telco? And a bleak festive season ahead for many as the cost of living crunch worsens. Joining us on the panel, ANU academic Intifar Chowdhury, a youth researcher who has a PhD in political science. Liberal Senator for Western Australia, Dean Smith, the Shadow Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury. Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services, Stephen Jones, the Labor member for Whitlam. Independent member for Kooyong, Monique Ryan, a former Director of Neurology. And economist Chris Richardson, who has worked at the Federal Treasury in Canberra and the IMF in Washington. Also tonight, the PM under fire over international travel. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis and I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we are meeting. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quandra is the hashtag, please get involved. To get us started tonight, here's a question from Jack Peters.
In the light of recent events, is Anthony Albanese ever going to come back to Australia, or is he the new Australian ambassador for life?
Stephen, spicy.
Jack, thanks for your question. A big part of the Prime Minister's job is representing the government and our national interest overseas. And if I could refer to the most recent trip, he was over in the US at an APEC meeting. What's APEC? Well, it's an economic meeting of nation-state leaders. It was actually an organisation formed by Australia in the 1990s to ensure that we could better integrate our trading systems. Why does it matter to Australia? 1 in 4 jobs in Australia relies on our trade with those nations. It represents about 75% of the trade that Australia engages in. He was there quite simply to ensure that we weren't out of the big decisions that were being made on behalf of our country. And if you look back at all the other meetings that he's held and other countries that he's visited over the last 12, 18 months, it's pretty common in the first 12 months of a new government that they get very active and they get out there to introduce themselves and the country to other nations' leaders, and we do it in the national interest. And of course there was a coronation and a funeral in England that we had to go to as well. So a lot of reasons, a lot of work, and the whole team of us have been busy back here in Australia while he's been gone.
Okay, so Dean, the coalition has been making hay with this, but if you look at the stats, Scott Morrison, Tony Abbott, they made a similar number of trips. So is this just political?
Well, PK, I like to say that all politics is local. And no one would dispute the fact that our national leader is also our international leader and has to travel abroad for significant events. But that can't come at the expense of our domestic issues. And I think this particular trip has drawn a bit of criticism because we had a High Court decision. People like myself and others argue that the Parliament was slow to legislate in response to that High Court decision. And I think is a powerful example of the Prime Minister not keeping both eyes on all of the issues, which is what required.
Just to fact check you there, the Prime Minister says he was involved in the conversations around the legislation that we saw in the Parliament. I mean, we do have phones and the internet, like he was clearly involved. Why isn't that good enough? Well,
I think in politics, where you physically are sends a very powerful demonstration about what your values and what your priorities are. It wasn't if the Prime Minister had to catch a scheduled flight to APEC, had access to special purpose aircraft. So I think Australians were looking for a better demonstration that his eyes were on our domestic issues as much as they were on the international issues.
So it's about the optics.
It's about the optics, but I would add to that too, that there's...
You missed one day of Parliament.
Sorry, we are...
One day.
Well, one day for a Prime Minister when there's a significant High Court issue, which was ruled upon, of which the government knew was coming, whatever the outcome of that High Court decision was, they knew that a decision was coming. And I think many Australians would be surprised to have learnt that the government was caught flat-footed.
OK, Monique, did you think it was appropriate that he went?
Oh, I think this is petty politics, this arguing about whether or not the Prime Minister needs to be in Parliament on a specific day. It was the APEC meeting and we need our leadership to represent it represent us at a really important meeting like this. Similarly, when the Prime Minister went to China, we need to repair our relationship with our most important trade partner, which had been left bruised and damaged, I would say, by the Morrison government. And I think that Mr Albanese's, Prime Minister Albanese's representation in China was effective, and we need our Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister to represent us well on the international stage.
You just mentioned China, so it's the perfect place for me to talk about that naval incident that we had. People might be across it, it's been in the news, and there was an Australian sailor injured. Minor injuries is our understanding, but from the sonar incident there has been a push, Monique, I'll just stay with you on this, for the Prime Minister to have raised this with the Chinese President Xi while he was overseas. He wouldn't clarify whether he had. Do you think he should clarify whether he raised it?
I think the most important thing is firstly to worry about the welfare of the diver, because sonar injuries, which can hurt your middle ear and cause other significant injuries, could be, threatening to that individual's career. So I hope he's okay. It sounds like it was a really nasty episode, and it does need to be examined effectively. But I don't know that we need to know every detail of every conversation that the Prime Minister had. Again, this to me smacks of petty politics. What's not important is the timing of the conversation itself, is the nature of the conversation and the fact that this was obviously a significant event, and I hope that it's being dealt with appropriately by diplomats. But again, I don't think we need to nitpick about every single thing that our senior politicians do. What we need to have is confidence and assurance that they're acting effectively on our behalf.
Yeah, I would love to. I'll come to you in a moment, but just Chris Richardson, do you think we should find out about whether this was raised with the Chinese leader?
No, some of these things have to be discussed very carefully and in private, and I have no problem with Prime Ministers travel. They all do it. This Prime Minister's travelled about the same as the others. I just can't get excited about that one.
You can't get excited. OK. Can you get excited about that?
I think I agree with Monique that this is petty politics, but the perception is there, and we can't discount the fact that people are not really confident. The ANU poll that came out in August, a nationally representative panel survey, shows that the general direct satisfaction with where the direction of the country, people are less and less satisfied. So I think it is true that Albanese is making the same number of trips, but what's happening at home, and just slightly touching on what Dean said, it's about people feeling that perhaps the issues at home are not getting as much attention as in the expense of perhaps issues outside.
Dean, your side of politics has been very critical this afternoon about the Prime Minister not revealing whether he'd raised it with President Xi. But I've heard from a couple of people on this panel now that he shouldn't have to reveal that level of detail. Just a clear question. Yes. Do you think he should have to reveal that?
Yes.
Why?
This is not petty politics. This was Chinese Defence Forces putting at risk the life of an Australian Defence Force personnel who was a diver undertaking important work on an Australian naval vessel. That is not petty politics. And if the life of Australian Defence Force personnel don't warrant an apology from the Chinese president, don't warrant some sort of disclosure from our own Prime Minister about what has happened, then what is the threshold? What is the threshold?
So you think this meets the threshold of disclosure for the Prime Minister to say...
This exceeds the threshold, would be my view, yes.
But the Prime Minister says, just to be clear, because we have to stick to all the facts as we know them right now, that this has been raised at the highest levels in the usual way. That's the language he used. So that implies that all of the diplomatic processes we have for raising this, it has been raised. Why is that not satisfactory?
Because I think the Australian electorate deserves a full and thorough explanation. A full and thorough explanation. Has an apology been sought by the Chinese leader in regards to this particular episode, which is very risky, has endangered the life of Australian Defence personnel? I think that is not petty politics. I think that takes the issue to a
Anthony Albanese should have said to the Chinese president, offer an apology?
Yes.
Can I just say on look, what the Liberal Party and what Dean and others are trying to do is deliberately set a bar that they know the government cannot meet. They know full well that relations between countries follow certain protocols. They know that the moment that the facts were verified in this, the acting Prime Minister and the Defence Minister issued a stern public statement expressing the views of the Australian government. They also know that at the time the Prime Minister was meeting with the Chinese leadership, all the facts were not known. They know that. So what they are deliberately trying to do is set a bar in this issue, in this matter, that they know the government can't meet. And if I can say quite frankly, the lesson we need to learn from the coalition government in terms of our relationship with China is exactly what not to do. Is exactly what not to do. Because they left us on the back foot in the Pacific, they left us on the nose in Europe, and they left us out on the cold in China. That's how they managed our international relationships.
So
we
you're
have
saying,
worked very, very hard over the last 18 months to repair those relationships.
So you're saying it should be raised discreetly. Is that what you're essentially saying?
It should be raised in the appropriate ways, in the way that diplomatic issues are dealt with, and through the diplomatic channels.
So it's not leader to leader?
Let me go directly to that issue. What the Prime Minister won't do, and no sane, respectable, grown-up leader of any government will do, is reveal the private conversations they have with another world leader, let alone reveal the text messages that they send to another world leader. It is important in relationships between governments that you can have a private conversation and know the details of that conversation stay private.
OK. And we can bring you the topic of our online poll now too. We're asking you, should the government proceed with its planned Stage 3 tax cuts? You can cast your votes anonymously on the Q&A Facebook and YouTube accounts or the ABC News X and Instagram accounts. We'll bring you the results a little later in the show. Now I'd like to bring in Sonny Williams.
Hi.
Hi, Sonny.
My question is, what will you do to help all businesses that have suffered financially during the Optus blackout, and as the cost of living is already putting burdens on businesses financially?
OK. Well, Monique, I might start with you. What do you think should happen? What should Optus be doing, and what should the government be doing to help businesses as well who've dealt with this?
Thanks, Sonny. Look, I think, firstly, Optus, needs to set things right in its own home, essentially. We've seen two significant issues with Optus of late, and clearly that's causing a crisis of consumer confidence with Optus. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we all need to have faith in our systems, our infrastructure, and we've seen more and more in recent weeks and months the extent to which they are subject to hacking and to cybersecurity questions, and that is a cause of great alarm, I think, for all of us. Last week there was the issue with DP ports and the closure of a significant freight terminal, more than one freight terminal in Australia. I think cybersecurity is the single biggest threat to us at this point in time, and we need to have faith that all of our large and small businesses are inured from that, and I was really encouraged to see that the government is setting up a program for that in the near future, because all of the various pathways and networks that we have, the weakest point lays all of them open to cybersecurity, hacking and the like, and that can affect all of us. If we had Optus go down, I had friends who were working in public hospitals telling me on the weekend how they couldn't get results and they couldn't get through to wards and they couldn't contact colleagues, and they were really concerned about the potential impact of that on their patient care. If we had Optus and Telstra go down at the same time, it doesn't bear thinking about. So we do need the government to make sure that small and large businesses have the security that they need to have, and that the government is dealing appropriately with the increasing threat of massive cybersecurity issues.
Chris, what should happen in this event?
They should get better, and we need to work on our defence around this sort of stuff. But we also need, I think, to understand that we live in an age in which crap happens.
This was a really long crap, though. Sorry, but it was a giant long day. Sorry, but it was. It went on and on.
There is nothing like live TV. But it's not just, cyber and hacking. We live in a world which is stunningly interconnected, and the volatility is showing up in my area, the world economy and economies. You're seeing it in geopolitics, wars, cold wars, You're seeing it in climate extreme events. You're seeing extreme events in our health with pandemics. And the bad news is, yes, we should get better at defending against this stuff, but it's going to get worse. The greater the complexity of the world, the more likely that stuff will break, and that interconnectedness. So something going wrong in cyber can affect the economy, which is what we're talking about with, should we see some sort of redress. The bad news is, I'm afraid, it's going to get worse.
Oh, OK, on that cheery note, thanks, Chris. Intifa, what is the government's role for stepping in and helping all the businesses who suffered? Or is it Optus's responsibility?
Well, Optus is a private entity. I think that's a very important thing that we're missing here, right? And government cannot intervene into Optus as it can to Telstra. This was the second crap from Optus in 2 years' time.
On that theme.
And it's very difficult to have faith when there was what appears to be a cyber hack. And then the next thing you have is an outage at this scale and not enough information or updates after the outage, and much shoulder shrugging. It's like, oh, these things happen, just deal with it. But the thing is that with FPOS machines, for example, we had faced similar situations during the fires in 2020. So why wasn't these sort of cybersecurity events enough to raise awareness amongst the public? This ransomware that's going on, much of us, I can bet, are not even aware of what it is and how it can hijack our computers, our files, and take money from us. So I think public awareness is important, but also private companies like Optus. I don't know the details to it, but after what happened last year, where are the risk management strategies, right? I think it's fair and reasonable to say that Australians can expect something like, transparency, accountability, and also proper risk management strategies in place for crises like this.
Stephen, the CEO is gone. That can't be the end of the story, though, can it?
No, it certainly isn't. Can I just clarify a couple of things?
If you do it briefly, sure.
Almost certainly wasn't a cyber incident.
No.
It was a good old-fashioned software stuff-up when they changed one system over to another. It was a technical disaster. It was a public relations catastrophe because they didn't explain to their customers and to the Australian people what had happened, what was going on, and what they were going to do to fix it. Even if they'd just come out and said basic information, Australians would have, and their customers would have felt more assured. Can I say on the issue of liability, the liability is Optus's. They stuffed it.
And
they're
giving data out. Is that enough?
And look, if I was a small business who'd lost a day's takings, I'm not convinced that a few extra gigs of data was going to cut it.
Should there be a class action? Do you expect there to be?
That'll be a matter for others.
But do you expect?
But there are avenues available. I'm no longer lawyering, so I'm not going to give free advice over on your show. But I wouldn't be surprised if those actions did come forward, and there are avenues available through our existing laws which would enable consumers to bring those matters forward.
OK, and do you think Optus needs to do more than just lose a CEO?
100%. Like, for all the reasons that Chris and Monique and others have said, like, we are now connected, immeasurably more productive. Our societies are immeasurably more effective and efficient because of this, and therefore immeasurably more reliant, and therefore the obligation to ensure that it works and it works properly is greater because the consequences are greater.
Dean?
Well, let's not lose sight of, I think, an important development, and we've not seen it with other Australian CEOs that have put Australians at risk. And that is that the Optus CEO decided to stand down, to resign from her position and take full responsibility.
It's always the woman that goes, though,
I think that is a really powerful message to men and women CEOs of other Australian companies.
But Monique, you think it's mainly women?
I'm sorry, I don't think so. I mean, what about PwC? What about the consulting companies? What about Christine Holgate? Christine Holgate, she can go. The Liberal Party, she can. Mr Morrison, she can go. It's always the women that go. We don't have any insight into what happens in Optus. It's a private company and it's run from Singapore, and they're trying to protect their commercial interests and things like that. But I think there is a bit of an emerging pattern. You don't see the men falling on their sword, and you don't see the men getting pushed out the door.
Well, Alan Joyce went, but with a whole lot of money.
Handshake.
It seemed like a enjoyable
leave.
Yeah.
I don't know, it just feels a bit too quick and a bit too convenient, really, for me. I'd like to understand things.
Do you think it was too quick?
I think the integrity of the Optus CEO has been enhanced. I absolutely think. I don't think it's about men or women, not at all. What we've seen is
the point that Monique makes is that she says women fall on their swords, but you don't see men doing it as much. That's the argument. You don't think so?
I've never really sat down and sort of done that analysis, to be honest. But my comment was about corporate Australia. My comment was about corporate Australia and what Australians can start to expect from other CEOs when, as Stephen said, their businesses are put in jeopardy, healthcare is put in jeopardy, etc.
Okay. I think people should take responsibility. Do we all agree with that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I knew that we'd be in furious agreement with that broad statement. Next, we'll hear from Julie Knott.
This is more to the politicians. What long-term policies are you considering to put in place to protect the rights of renters? At 67 years, I have rented most of my life, and at the present situation of low rental vacancies is very worrying. I left my last property as the rent after COVID was going up $200 a week. I have been lucky as I've been able to find a shared home, but there's many that have not got this opportunity and don't have home security.
Dean, what do you do about rents going up to this extent?
I think how the rental crisis has manifested itself in this country is very, very serious, and it is affecting people differently and disproportionately in our community. It is absolutely, and I don't know your particular circumstances, Julie, but I'm acutely aware that for older women, middle-aged women, perhaps with no access to superannuation, relationships perhaps having broken down, are now in a position of vulnerability because they're now having to rent. And of course, a similar but different story for younger Australians. I think the solution to the rental crisis in our country will be multifaceted. I personally believe we need to encourage mum and dad investors to stay in the private property market to make more housing supply available. I do think our country should be looking at build-to-rent propositions, specifically in terms of how they might support middle-aged women, how they might support young people. At the moment, I don't think that idea is suitably mature enough to provide an answer to the rental crisis. And of course, we discussed it last time on the show, PK. We do have to have a conversation about making sure that our migration patterns are properly modelled, properly planned for, so that we can avoid these sorts of crises.
Intafar, obviously, rent is a growing cohort. Renters are a growing cohort of the Australian population, but if rents are going up to this kind of extent, people are finding it completely unaffordable. What's the solution?
Well, there's a supply and a demand side to the housing crisis, right? And there are multiple factors that impact the supply side, multiple factors that impact the demand side. We should have been building more houses. For whatever reasons, we haven't been doing that. Let's say because of planning rules, local councils, construction skills shortage in that industry. And then we have got the demand side where we've got tax incentives, incentives for investors, people who can afford keep on buying more and more and more, and then people who can't afford, they're just out of the market, which, as Dean said, I agree with Dean that it is disproportionately impacting Australians, younger Australians, but also older Australians, pensioners, that they're perhaps, one rent increase away from eviction to homelessness. And these are dire problems. These are problems that are affecting Australians all across the board. Mostly people who are low-income earners, younger families, people in disadvantaged areas. But I do not agree that migration is the cause of the problem. Reducing migration in the short term perhaps would speak to the demand, But then we have to be very careful, calculated, and have a sober discussion around it, because it's not a bivariate relationship. There are multiple things happening. Reducing migration will impact the economy in many other ways. So you have to be very careful about, we can't be scapegoating, right? Super careful. It can't be a knee-jerk reaction, because we need people to build houses, and we've got skill shortage in these building industries.
Now I've got a question from Julian Coxall.
Thank you.
Hi, Julian.
Hi. I must do a shout out to Dr. Ryan. I love what the independent politicians are achieving and doing. So my question, which is completely linked to what you were just talking about, is given the migration levels, why isn't there some kind of link to migration levels to building capability? And I say that as a retired building professional. We cannot build the amount of residential properties needed with the current migrant intake.
Okay, Chris.
Don't
So you're
retire.
essentially-
Don't retire.
But you're saying, why isn't there sort of a nexus or a connection between people coming in and the amount of stock we're making?
Correct.
Chris, should there be?
There is a relation. Intafar is exactly right, that what we've messed up is housing. We may need to react partly around migration, but what we've messed up is housing. And to Julie's point, right, you know, across 40 years, we have turned housing into a misery machine in Australia. And this is a stunning national fail.
A misery machine.
A misery. So today, it's almost certainly today that we have clicked over as a nation to housing prices being a new record high. They fell for a time as interest rates went up. We had a great experiment, terrible experiment over the past year with interest rates roaring up, and yet house prices went up. I used to think interest rates would do the trick. They won't. We have to build. How do we build? We need the builders. But what we need more than anything else, I mean, for 40 years we have had, you know, not in my backyard, council by council by council, decision, neighbourhood by neighbourhood. And after 40 years, we haven't built. And when we do build, we attach all these conditions which make it incredibly expensive. I would love not to touch migration, but we have screwed this up so massively as a nation that we temporarily need to look at migration as part of this equation.
So when you say, I just want to pin you down on this, temporarily look at migration, because you've always been a fan of migration. You're an economist, often you people are fans of migration. Now you're saying, how long then? For how long?
So we have now 725,000 students from the rest of the world studying in Australia. A year ago, that was 555,000. That increase, right? You know, so yes, we sell education to the world, and a lot of that we do well, and some of it we don't do as well. But it is a big part of the increase in the pressure at the moment, and it is a relatively concentrated bit where we can make a change. The federal government needs to actually fund universities instead of, you know, insisting that they make money from foreign students to pay for the domestic students. We can do this better. The problem with 40 years of not in my backyard is if we have perfect policies tomorrow, and you know the government is trying to do some things, moving that lever is great, but perfect policies tomorrow, it's going to take more than a decade to repair this, right? That misery machine is not going to disappear.
Okay, so for how long would we need to pause or at least reduce migration?
The bigger lever that we've got to do over time is to insist that local councils say yes to more, and the government is gently starting that process. It's up more to the states, but it's got to move, and unless and until we do that, we need, I would say, students as the lever, pull back for a while.
Okay. Stephen, are you prepared to do that?
A couple of things. I agree with Chris that we need to look at the student stuff. I agree with that. I think it's a job of work that needs to be done. But also, I don't want to... Like, Julie, you asked a really direct question about what we're doing for renters, particularly older, and I want to give you a really direct answer.
So he's also going back... He's also going
Big
back
sin,
a
I'm
question.
told.
Julian, I'd be outraged.
Wrong. More rights for renters. More rights for renters, particularly older renters and long-term tenancies. It exists in other countries. It hasn't existed in a systemic way here in Australia, and we've got to do it. The pattern of rental has changed in Australia. It used to be something that just young people did. That's no longer the case, and we've got to face up to that. So 2 things that we need to do, plus having a look at the issues that Chris has said. We've got to build more homes, so we've got a nationally agreed accord, 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years. We've got to deal with all the things that Chris has said to reach that target.
So you think there needs to be a reduction in migration as well?
No, I think if... can I come back to that? I do want to answer that.
Just
I don't want to
answer it.
dodge
Just
it.
do it now.
I don't want to dodge it. I want to answer... Even if we build more homes and build more homes explicitly for renters, that in and of itself won't deal with the issue of renters being turfed out for no reason. So I think we need to have better regulation around long-term tenancies. We've got to work with the states because they have the constitutional levers to do that. In terms of students, in terms of migration, like it's a chicken and egg to our friend up there. We need more houses built. Where we're going to get the labour from? We generally import that from overseas. So a lot of these things are a feedback loop. Chris is right though that the big cause for the massive ramp up in immigration over the last 12 months post-COVID has been big jump up in student numbers.
Okay, when you say long-term leases, before I go to you, Dean, what are you talking about here?
I'm talking about people who will probably be renting a house for their entire life.
So what sort of leasing do you think they should be entitled to, and what would the federal government do?
Well, the federal government doesn't have the constitutional powers, but we can use levers.
You do. You have a lot of power, though.
We have a lot of powers, that's right.
You do.
So it requires us working with the states. And one of the big things that came out of the Accord and the last National Cabinet Agreement on this was having rental rights on the agenda and ensuring that we dealt with long-term tenancies and tenancy rights. It is a big unfinished piece.
PK,
Dean,
the
on
point that I
migration.
wanted to make about, this is a very, very important issue because access to housing affects people's quality of life in retirement, and it's the most important determinant in terms of that quality of life experience for people. So the issue is very important and it's urgent because we know we've got the consequences of an ageing population and other things.
And if you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A Live with Intifa Chowdhury, Dean Smith, Stephen Jones, Monique Ryan and Chris Richardson. Lots to discuss tonight. Here's Luke, Actostrat.
Small businesses employ over 5 million Australians and are greatly impacted by the cost of living crisis. 43%, almost half, of all Australian small businesses are not even breaking even at the moment, according to the Small Business Ombudsman. Shouldn't the government be doing more to support small business and to assist with the current cost crisis?
Well, I'll start with Dean, just because we just ended with you, Dean. Do you think there should be more done for... And just to get some clarity before I get an answer, 43%.
Almost 1 million small businesses not breaking even.
Let's so we can get you on mic. You're saying 43%. What situation are they in?
They're not making a profit. They're not breaking even. So you've almost got 1 million Australian small businesses currently hanging in the balance. That's data from the Small Business Ombudsman's Office, independent data.
Okay, so it's most recent data.
Correct.
43% not breaking even.
Correct.
And do we have any idea how many of those may hit the wall?
Look, we don't have a crystal ball, PK, but this is exactly why we're asking the government to look at every single lever they have over the coming weeks and months to support small business around Australia.
And what levers do you think they have, if I can ask, to do something about what sounds to me like a staggering percentage?
Cost and energy relief, but particularly a focus on red tape, deregulation. There's currently 6 different definitions of small business at a federal level. So a small business can change in the eyes of a regulator depending on what time of day it is. We need to harmonise that, and we need a workplace relations system that small businesses can understand, frankly. It's way too complex at the moment.
Okay, that's a bit of a list, but I get it. There's a few things that you want to do. Dean, obviously, according to the latest Ombudsman's report, small business is struggling. What interventions would you like to see?
Well, thank you for the question, Luke. I mean, we hear very much about the cost of living crisis that's sort of confronting the country, but we don't hear much about the cost of doing business crisis that is now facing small business. Many of those cost of living challenges that families and others have are the same sorts of challenges that businesses have. Top of mind for myself comes, extending the instant asset write-off to more small businesses to make it better and easier for them to acquire equipment, sort of keep pace of technological developments. In addition to that, perhaps even lifting that instant asset write-off from $25,000, I think, to $30,000. So these are some immediate things that can be done. But of course, in your question is, some unintended consequences. When businesses go out of business, people lose their jobs. People lose their livelihoods, and many small businesses have borrowed against their homes. So I think there's been a lot of attention in the Parliament given to cost of living issues, but I think it's a small business experience that is now going to be front of mind for many, many people, particularly as we go into the Christmas and the summer. Many people would think, well, this is a prime opportunity for small businesses, not realising that they are facing significant challenges on their own already.
Yeah, and full disclosure, Luke, you're actually the new CEO of the Small Business Association, right?
COSBOA.
COSBOA. So you've got that hat on, just to be clear to people about, your advocacy. Minister.
Thanks. Cheers, Luke. Good to see you again. Three things. Apart from managing the economy in a way to bring inflation down over time, which means interest rates could come down, they're things that are bearing heavily down upon small business, but that's not in the three things. The three things, we are doing what Dean has suggested around the instant tax write-off, as you know. But the things I want to focus on, we've got full employment, which means every small business I talk to are grappling to find or hang on to their workers. So we've got to backfill the skill stuff. So the work we're doing in rebuilding TAFE and fee-free TAFE and ensuring that we're training the next generation of workers, key. Second thing is around energy. You're right. The long term, the only sustainable answer is ensuring we re-gear our energy generation and transmission system to make it sustainable and cheaper. That won't happen overnight. So we've seen price shocks which have worked their way through the economy, bearing down on small business hard. The energy bill relief that we've put through the Parliament, you didn't vote for it, Dean, but we put through the Parliament late last year is directed at that issue. Third thing, Monique raised cyber. Big issue, big threat, and ensuring that we have cyber protection strategies which are fit for purpose for small business.
Okay, so that's what you've done so far. Is there more coming?
Always looking at things that we can do.
In the next budget?
Always looking at things we do. We're putting our policies together for the next budget as we speak.
I think these are excellent solutions, but they are like longer-term solutions, which we definitely need. I think you're after short-term solutions, quick solutions right now, people who are finding it difficult to pay rent, people who are having to cut hours for their employees, and mostly casual employees, people who are not making profit at all. And I think the best solution to this is pouring more money in to rent, for example, rental assistance. Where is that money going to come from? Perhaps taxing big businesses? I don't know. Maybe that's one idea, perhaps.
Chris?
First, the size of the problem, because I don't think people realise how bad it is. But we measure, believe it or not, your standard of living, right? And it's gone down almost 10% in the last 2 years.
When you say whose has gone down, can you be specific?
That is the incomes that Australians get from anything, less what they're paying on tax and interest per head, get rid of inflation, so it is a genuine standard of living measure. And that drop is more than anything you've seen in a recession. The good news is it hasn't, by and large, been from an increase in unemployment, and that's great. But wages have not kept up with prices. Interest rates have roared up. So if you're a wage earner, if you're a borrower, and the tax take, personal tax, has roared. This is huge. So there are two requests of government. One is, help small business, help families, give them money, as Intifa was saying. But it's also help the Reserve Bank fight inflation, which is the cause of a lot of this. And that actually means take money away, take money out of the economy to slow it down and calm down inflation. So if you're wondering why they're not doing much, it's because it's not easy to do much, right? You need to put money in and take it out at the same time. Governments all around the world, this government, last government, all around the world, they're doing little things and they're pretending they're big things because it is a genuinely hard thing to do.
OK, well explained. Next, I'd like to go to Tracy Burton.
Good evening. With cost of living on the rise, so much more needs to be done. So can't we all agree that now is not the time for the stage 3 tax cuts for the wealthy? But instead, we could actually use that funding to provide more support to the people who are really struggling.
Monique.
So I guess just speaking to what we were just talking about, if you're talking about trying to bring down inflation, one thing you might not do is put $313 billion back into the economy. And I personally, I feel that putting the $313 billion that the government is planning to put back into the economy with the stage 3 tax cuts, which are scheduled to start on July the 1st next year, would probably continue that cycle of inflation, RBA trying to hit what looks like a nail with a big hammer, so further interest rate rises, which really have a disproportionate effect on people who have mortgages and then down the road on people who are renting. So my personal feeling, I've said this before, is that we should re-look at the stage 3 tax cuts and that we should as a country be mature enough to look at something which was legislated in 2019, before the pandemic, before the current cost of living crisis, before the crisis of housing affordability and availability, and see if it's still fit for purpose, and have the maturity as a political body to make changes to something which is no longer in the country's best interests. The proposal I've put out recently looked at a really modest change to the stage 3 cuts to make them a bit more fair, to keep the 37% bracket, which would basically, it's a relatively modest change, but it would generate $8 billion a year. And with $8 billion, we could double the Commonwealth rental assistance payment. We could, which is 1.5 million people who are really struggling to pay their rent, could have significant benefit from that, and would have $3 billion left over with which we could build 100,000 homes over 10 years. I think, you know, that's just one suggestion. There's lots of different ways that we could make the transition a little bit more fairly. But I think it is time for us to look at whether or not the stage 3 tax cuts are in the country's best interests. In their current form, I don't feel that they are.
You're saying they'll be inflationary. Do you think they will be, Intifa?
Will there be inflation?
Will the stage 3 tax cuts, when they, you know, hit people's pocket, be inflationary?
It really depends on how it's being implemented. To be honest, I don't know. It really depends on, there are many sort of alternative methods going around as well. So to answer your question, I don't know.
Well, let me put this to you. We know that the RBA now forecasts inflation to hit that sort of 3% range at the end of 2025. Are they badly timed now?
Yeah.
How badly timed?
Yeah, I agree with you, Monique, too, as an idea to tweak them. I don't think they are as unfair as people think they are, and I build models that do this, and I cost the $8 billion, but they're too big, and they're coming too soon. If you have an inflation problem, they will tip. It's not $313 billion straight away, but the cost for the year following 1 July, that starts 7 months, is $21 billion. That is the equivalent of 2 or 3 interest rate cuts. Or in other words, if you're wondering why the government doesn't do more about helping, it's because there is a pre-programmed massive amount of help coming. It is coming to taxpayers. If you're giving money to taxpayers, you have to remember that the top 5% of personal taxpayers pay a third of all personal tax, right? You know, so they're going to get a chunk, but it means that you're not going to get relief from the Reserve Bank. The rest of the world can start to expect interest rates to be cut in about 6 months' time. In Australia, maybe a year, because these big tax cuts are coming. So
you're saying people's interest rates will stay high because of these tax cuts?
Higher for longer, yeah. I think
because of these tax cuts?
Because it's, as we were saying a moment ago, it's a question of how much money there is in the economy. What the Reserve Bank is doing is taking money out of the economy, stopping you spending, right, you know, in the hope that slows inflation down. This is putting a large amount of money into the economy. It works the other way.
Should they be delayed?
Yeah, there is a good case to delay. We have a fight over inflation. I don't think they need a massive change. I am happy with a tweak along those lines, and that preserves... we rely more on personal tax than most other rich nations. There is a genuine case for that cut, but maybe not quite so big and not quite so soon.
So when should they hit?
Well, I would like to see inflation lower, but put them back 12 months, that would sound fine to me.
OK, 12-month delay. Dean, would you support it?
Well, just in case you're wondering, I'm not Angus Taylor. I'm not Angus Taylor.
Well, you don't look like him, but you know a little about money.
There's something in these stage 3 tax cuts that I think gets overlooked, and it's very, very important. And when I saw that Chris was coming on the show tonight, I thought we were going to have a broad-ranging discussion about tax reform in our country, because we know that the way that taxes are collected in our country, it just does not work. 60% of our taxes come from personal income taxes. And the point in the stage 3 tax cuts that I think is too readily overlooked is that 95% of Australian taxpayers will pay no more than 30 cents in the dollar as a result of the stage 3 tax cuts. So when we think about the tax reform challenge in our country, people say, oh, it's all too difficult, there'll never be bipartisanship, we can't move forward. Well, actually, this is a small and I think necessary step that takes us on the pathway to that bigger...
I get your broader point about tax reform.
I don't think
back
no
on delay and inflation.
To Monique's point, to be fair, no one can deny that this is no longer 2019. That's a fair point. But the coalition is currently committed...
We acknowledge that 2023 is not 2019.
That's right, yes. So,
we're in furious agreement.
We can all agree on that.
Bipartisan. I love agreement.
But you know, the current position of the coalition is to support the stage 3 tax cuts, and I agree with Chris that the priority in this country is to bring inflation down, because no one is untouched by the menace that inflation causes to their savings, to income inequality.
Sure, but if we're to take you seriously when you say to the government, where's your plan to fight inflation, then surely you have to look at these tax cuts and say, probably not a great way to fight inflation.
Well, PK, that's just not a call I can make,
right?
And it's not a call I'm going to make. But I hear the point. I hear the point. And you know, Chris is someone who I read avidly in the AFR and other places, and listen to his contribution.
Okay. And we can bring you the result of our online poll now. We asked you, should the government proceed with its planned stage 3 tax cuts? More than 5,400 of you responded. Here's how you voted. 29% said yes, but most of you say no. 61% said no, and 10% said they're unsure. So, Stephen Jones, I am not ever pretending that a poll run out of a TV show is like, you know, an election. But it's a pretty strong result. And we've heard our very esteemed colleague here, Chris Richardson, say that perhaps there should be a delay of up to a year, right? That's what you say, Chris. Do you think it's worth considering?
Look, of course, I always take the comments that Chris makes and his analysis of these things very seriously.
You better. You're like the guru, the economic guru. They're all following.
Serious point. I've
Do you worry? Just let me put it this way. Do you worry about inflation and these tax cuts?
Our number one priority at the moment is budget repair and inflation, and working those two things together. We think we're doing a good fist to the first, and you know, for all the reasons Chris mentioned earlier, we've got challenges, international and domestic, with inflation.
So are you worried about the impact these tax cuts might have on inflation?
I'm worried about a whole bunch of things.
No, but I'm asking
on
just
the
about
inflation, on the inflation front. I'll just be blunt and direct in the answer, PK. Our position on stage 3 hasn't changed, and we'll look at all the circumstances in the years ahead, but our position, as stated by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, on stage 3 hasn't changed.
Wouldn't you want to make the right economic call for the country?
As we always will. As we always will.
So would your position change if the economic circumstances commanded that it should?
Look, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals, but what I can say, our number one economic policy objective is fighting inflation.
OK. Now let's hear from Michael Sanderson.
over here.
Hi, Michael.
How are you?
Excited to have you here.
It's good.
In Sydney, live.
I just want to make a comment before I ask my question. Nobody looks at Japan. Japan has a cash rate of minus 0.1%, 3% inflation. They don't have a housing problem. They're a major G7 country. Look at Japan.
Okay. I'll take that
Now
as
my
a comment.
question-
Japan, we'll do a special Japan show. I've just committed to it.
And bring
now
in...
to your question.
All right, my question. Monique Ryan, although positive, don't you think that the politicians declaring diary entries without declaring donations is a fruitless exercise?
Thank you so much. So I think you're referring to the lobbying bill that I lodged in Parliament last week. And the idea of it is to shine a light on what goes on in Parliament House. So there are 15 lobbyists to every politician walking the streets of the halls of Parliament. And they're people who are representing the fossil fuel industries, gambling, vaping, Qantas, the banks, and they're getting in the ears of politicians and influencing decisions that are made every day by politicians.
There are a lot of them.
There's a lot of them. And what I'm trying to do is to open up what goes on there. So the bill includes a number of things, which includes a lobbying register that actually has teeth, so we'll know exactly who is in the building, but also opening up of lobbyist diaries and ministerial diaries so that we know who's meeting with who, why and when. And there's also some other premises about closing the revolving door so that right now very many ministers and senior public advisors go straight out of Parliament into cushy jobs in industry. And really there's unhealthy and relationships which are just too close between many of the lobbying groups and the politicians with whom they interact. So I think that's a really important piece, and it's something I'll be working on very hard in the next 18 months. I think it's something which would really improve the integrity and the transparency of what goes on in Parliament. Having said that, as you say, we need reform around electoral donations and donations to political parties and greater transparency about that. One of the lovely things about the crossbench is that we work collaboratively together on things that matter to us, and my colleague Kate Chaney has been working on a private member's bill aimed at attacking that. Last week, I presented my lobbying bill, Zali Steggall presented a bill on truth in political advertising, and Helen Haynes presented a bill to increase transparency around government grants. We're all trying to improve, we're trying to drain the swamp essentially. We're trying to improve the quality of the politics that we have in Canberra, and they're things that we feel very strongly about.
Intifa, I want to bring you in here. I mean, you've done a lot of work on young people losing trust in democracy. Is this sort of transparency necessary to rebuild it?
I think, Monique, this is commendable. If you can fly it, like, hats off, because I think some of the solutions to the problems that we've been talking about, housing crisis, for example, we are a wealthy country. Australia is a wealthy country. We are actually doing pretty well compared to our counterparts. It's sad that we still have instances where people don't have a roof over their heads. It's sad that people are struggling and going by from paycheck to paycheck. We do have the money, but where is the money going? Now, I think a lot of the answers might be in those diaries. So I think it's very important that that we know what's happening. In your question about the youth, young people on average do not trust political institutions and politicians, and that's why over the past 2 decades we've seen a move away from political parties. Is that a good or bad thing? I won't talk onto it. But there's a move...
thing.
It's a good thing.
Well, it suited you.
But that also means that young people are kind of also checking out from the political process. That could encourage political apathy as well. Good for us that we have compulsory voting to tie them back in, but trust, satisfaction with democracy, satisfaction with the direction in which the country is heading, we are talking about future custodians of democracy. If these markers are declining, we have a problem. Because the next generation of political leaders do not want to be political leaders because they don't trust the system. So this is one way, one solution really to recover trust.
Super quick answer from both of you. I'm going to marginalise the mainstream politicians on this. Do you need to drain the swamp?
I think transparency is a good thing, and I think that community expectations should be in high level of correlation with the transparency mechanisms. Personally, just emphasise that personally, I do like the idea of cooling off periods between ministers before they go into private sector enterprises, and probably very, very senior people in the public service as well as in ministerial offices. A private view, but just to sort of paint a fuller picture of who are the lobbyists around our corridors of power, they are the Salvation Army as well. They are human rights advocates and organisations.
There is a mix.
There is a mix. There is a mix. So so the lobbyists does provide an important role in bringing information to parliamentarians, making sure that every view is canvassed in a policy discussion. So it's not all bad, but I support greater transparency, yes.
And Stephen, greater transparency? The government promised a lot of it, but you haven't backed it all in.
Just as a matter of principle, I'm diametrically opposed to us incorporating into our language anything from the US MAGA movement, just as a matter of principle. In the cart for the transparency stuff, nothing inherently wrong with advocacy. Lots of advocacy groups and lobbyists, small business, big business, welfare, housing, environment, it's all there in all its glory. It's why we've got a register to ensure that there is transparency about who's doing what. I see no problems with people seeing who I meet with.
Can I read your diary?
Yeah, I've got no problems with that. It'd be a good answer to the question that we all
So we don't have
often
to FOI it, you just slip it at the end of the show.
We all often get, what the hell do you do with your time? From 6 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. Happy for that to be...
Turning up to Q&A.
PK, democracy marches on the little things, and bless you. This stuff is incredibly important because we have lost trust. And there are good reasons why we have lost trust. And out of that, I would say donations most important, and we do need to do better.
In real time?
Absolutely, yes. What we do is not good enough because the big parties have incentives that they're costly. Well, tough luck. We need to change that.
Can I just say on the whole thing, it was a big moment 12 months ago. People have forgotten it. We introduced a National Anti-Corruption Commission exactly for these reasons, to ensure there was greater scrutiny of public office, including politicians.
Now, I'm going to the last question, and I'm going to ask you all for a very quick answer with your top idea. To finish tonight's discussion, here's Grace Dyer.
Considering the concerns about economic downturns affecting attitudes towards minorities, the pessimistic outlook on the economy, and the impact of rising housing costs, what concrete steps or policies do you believe should be implemented to provide meaningful relief and ensure a more inclusive economic future for the younger generation?
Okay. One thing we could do.
Bring young people into discussions, encourage them, talk to them.
Too often in politics we hear about why things can't be done. I think we should be asking people why things can be done.
0 to 6 are the most formative years. What happens in those years has a huge determinative impact on the rest of a person's life, particularly their education, so more investment in early childhood education. If you only had to pick one thing, I'd go there.
Right, because you've got a budget coming up and you're actually in the government.
Well, we've already done... Yep, and look at what we did in our last budget. It was pretty good on this front.
Universal childcare, like a universal system?
Our system, well,
it's not universal.
Massive increase in funding into early childhood education, PK, check your language, that's what we call it nowadays.
Yeah, but the free, check my language, sorry, my kids are teenagers now. But really,
it is,
just like the state school system, do you think we should have, from a much younger age, access to...
We are working with the states on this, including the preschool years, to ensure that there is more access and cheaper, if not free, access to that early childhood education, because we think it's critical.
OK. Monique?
The reason why I'm here, and I think the reason why all of us should be here, is to ensure that the next generation has a habitable and hospitable planet, and that's what I'll work on, climate change.
And to give you the housing, which is the incredible thing that we have stuffed up. It's got to be yes in my backyard. No more of the not in my backyard. We have to change. That will make a massive difference eventually.
So give me an example. What should we say yes to? High rise in your backyard?
It's the middle ring. There are lots of suburbs not so far away where you've got single homes on blocks of land. That's dumb.
And on that note, that's all we have time for. Thanks to our excellent panel, Intifad Chowdhury, Dean Smith, Stephen Jones, Monique Ryan and Chris Richardson. Thank you for sharing your stories and questions. Next week, I'll be with you live from Melbourne with a final Q&A for the year. Head to our website to register to be in the audience. Last show, so it's going to be great, right? Good night.